Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Elise Salem. I'm the Associate Provost for Global Learning, and we are organizing what we think is a very important little conference called The War on Terror and the Fate of Human Rights in the U.S. Last year, our office organized a big symposium on human rights and conflict resolution. We had over 1,200 people attending over a 2-day period, and it generated such enthusiasm and interest amongst our students and our faculty that we knew we wanted to continue and keep the flame alive. I asked Joe Schuman, my colleague who organized the symposium last year, to help put together a conversation that deals with the intersection of domestic and foreign policy. We deal with international issues in our office, but the impact of the international global arena on domestic policies is very real. This is a university that has a growing program in homeland security, so we were interested in that tension and intersection between international global concerns and domestic security concerns. This is going to be a very fast-moving afternoon, and so we'll keep mindful of time. I just want to spend a couple of minutes to thank Joe Schuman for putting together at such short notice an excellent group of experts, and I know this is going to be a very thought-provoking afternoon. And big thanks to Rachel McCurr, our student assistant who works with us on the UN, who brought together a group of some dozen volunteers wearing red T-shirts and mobilized them to become very involved. Much of the session will take place in this room, but there are some breakout sessions which will move over to the Robeson Annex. You each have a program that tells you where you need to go. I will also urge you to fill out the evaluation form at some point, leave it either at registration or with one of our students here today. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Vince Warren. You have a complete biography of him in your folders. He is currently the executive director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, and he spent many years with the American Civil Liberties Union. He has been a leading African American voice for affirmative action. He litigated on behalf of plaintiffs who were removed from airplanes after September 11 because they were perceived to be Arab or Muslim. He worked with the ACLU's Hurricane Katrina response team. He monitored the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings in South Africa. He is a volunteer with the Haitian Refugee Center in Miami. We are very, very honored to hear what he has to say about the war on terror and the fate of human rights in the U.S. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much. I wanted to thank the Office of Global Learning for inviting me and for putting on this tremendously important conference. I want to thank Elise for the wonderful introduction and Professor Schuman for thinking of me as someone who might be worthy to address you. I also want to thank you all for coming. I think it's extremely important that we all engage in these issues of national security versus civil liberties and human rights. This is a struggle as a community, as an American community, that we will be having for many, many years to come. How do we remain safe? How do we come up with good policies that are designed to make us safe and at the same time preserve our very fundamental liberties, civil liberties, that preserve the fundamental civil rights of people who are South Asian, Arab, and Muslim, who are the target of this particular era of racial profiling in American history. And ultimately, how do we define who we are as a nation? And I think that one of the ways of thinking about that is how we define ourselves should be along the lines of how we treat those who we incarcerate and those who we are afraid of, and the things that they bring along with them. And I will sort of send out to you now that in the 7 years since September 11th, with respect to the post-9/11 policies, that we have lost standing in the international community in terms of how we deal with people that we incarcerate, how we treat them, how long they are detained, and the American system of justice that we hold so dear. So before I get started, I just need a show of hands. Are there any lawyers in the room? We have one lawyer. Okay. I want to get a sense of how familiar you are with the following terms, and so it'll help me guide my discussion. How many of you have heard of the term extraordinary rendition? Okay, we have a few people. How many of you have been following the fate of the men in Guantanamo? Good. And how many people have heard the term habeas corpus? And how many of you know exactly what habeas corpus means? Good, okay. Great. Let me start talking about the Center for Constitutional Rights. Center for Constitutional Rights has been around for 40 years. We have our history in the South civil rights struggle. The early people in the Center for Constitutional Rights worked with people on the ground in Mississippi and helped with what was called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Challenge when the Mississippi delegation to the presidential election refused to seat black delegates. The Center for Constitutional Rights intervened, worked with those community groups, and successfully sued for the seeking of those delegates. We've been working over the past 40 years on a range of issues. And because my time is short, I won't go into too much detail, and I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing now. Our work really revolves around three main areas. One is government misconduct, racial justice, and social and economic rights. In those cases, we, on the racial justice side, we have a lawsuit pending against the New York City for not hiring diverse firefighting force. In our government misconduct docket, we have a series of cases that relate to post 9/11 policies, which I'll talk about. We have a broad international human rights docket area. And in that docket area, and we are primarily a legal organization, we sue individuals and corporations for human rights abuses under the statute that was passed in 1789, at the same time that the Constitution was ratified, called the Alien Torts Statute. And the Alien Torts Statute allows you to sue in U.S. courts for torts, which are basically abuses or injuries that occur, that could have occurred abroad. So, for example, if either the victim or the perpetrator has a connection to the United States, even if the crime or the torture happened in another country, we can sue in U.S. federal courts. That was something that the Center for Constitutional Rights in 1979 sort of dusted off and discovered, and we've been using that fairly successfully over the past number of years. So currently, under the International Human Rights Framework, we have a lawsuit against the Chevron Corporation for human rights abuses, killing people in Nigeria. We have a case against a man named Toto Constant, who was a Haitian military leader who had a regime of torture and abuse, particularly against women, for suppressing political dissent. One of our most recent cases we have is a case against the mercenary group called Blackwater, which you may have heard of. Blackwater is a group of cowboy mercenaries that are in contract with the U.S. government, and they have been pretty systematically killing civilians. They shoot first and they ask questions later. So we sued Blackwater because it's a U.S. company. We represent the Iraqi civilians who were killed by Blackwater, and we're suing them in Washington, D.C. The third area of work that we do, we call our global justice project, which is really global detentions and Guantanamo. And so we represent, we filed the first habeas corpus petition for the men that were brought over from Guantanamo. We've represented hundreds of men. We've pulled together a group of what are called pro bono lawyers, which are lawyers that work for free. And these are from some of the largest law firms in the country. You know, they do corporate litigation, they do tax law, but we were able to round them up with the and to have them work on these cases really with the idea that this was really one of the largest fundamental civil rights disasters in recent American history. Certainly, since the internment of Japanese citizens during World War II. And using the information, we were able to have now 500 attorneys that work with us in representing the men in Guantanamo. In addition to the Guantanamo cases, which I'll talk more about, we have a case pending in New York called Turkman versus Ashcroft. And that case involved 12 men who were in New York, who were not here, who were out of immigration status. And right after September 11th in New York, there was a tremendous roundup of men who were primarily South Asian, Arab, or Muslim,